I really wish Apple made a touchscreen MacBook Pro, but because they don't, I've gone through great lengths to transform the iPad, a blown-up iPhone that Steve Jobs famously introduced while lounging in a chair, into something that looks suspiciously like a professional laptop. If the MacBook did have a touchscreen, I would almost certainly abandon my iPad, and I think others would too, a fact that I can't help but wonder whether Apple knows. Now, before we dive in, if you're just interested in the Brydge Max Plus keyboard review, you can skip to this timestamp, but then you'll miss out on some fascinating Apple history and why I think Apple secretly resents the relatively tiny professional segment of their customer base. Let's rewind to 2007. And I can't believe it's been this long, but 16 years ago, a company named Axiatron introduced a product they called the ModBook, a modification of a MacBook Pro that rebuilt the machine into a touchscreen tablet. They sold the computer for a couple of years, then went on to scam customers for over a decade on various crowdfunding platforms with the promise of an updated version called the ModBook Pro, and then ModBook Pro X, and finally the ModBook Pro X with Touch Bar. None of these shipped, and ModBook Inc. made off with a ton of customer funds. But the reason why people were so eager to hand over their money to a vaporware product is because Apple themselves refused to build their own touchscreen Mac. For years, even as Windows PC manufacturers iterate generation after generation on improving the touchscreen experience, Apple says no. In 2010, Steve Jobs said, "We've done a ton of user testing on this, and it turns out it doesn't work. Touch surfaces don't want to be vertical. It gives a great demo, but after a short period of time, you start to fatigue, and after an extended period of time, your arm wants to fall off. It doesn't work, it's ergonomically terrible." Then in 2020, Craig Federighi, Apple's senior vice president of software engineering, said, "I gotta tell you, when we released Big Sur and these articles started coming out saying, 'Oh my god, look, Apple is preparing for touch,' I was thinking like, whoa, why? We had designed and evolved the look for macOS in a way that felt most comfortable and natural to us, not remotely considering something about touch." So it's pretty clear what Apple's position is here, at least for the time being, and at least if we take them at their word. There have been plenty of examples of Apple changing their mind later after insisting they would never release, for example, a stylus for the iPad. And there's even rumors as of this January that Apple plans on introducing touchscreen Macs in the coming few years. To get a touchscreen Mac, you currently need to buy a separate product like a Wacom display or tether your iPad to your Mac with Sidecar. Now, one obvious solution here is to simply buy any number of dozens of PCs that offer touchscreens in a wide variety of inventive and versatile form factors. I have actually done this, but despite having used Windows and Mac side by side for decades at this point, I really prefer macOS when it comes to complex workflows. The major downside of sticking with Apple, of course, is that I'm really limiting my options. Apple doesn't sell a touchscreen Mac, so I had to work super hard to cram an iPad into my workflow because of its stylus support, and even after lots of experimentation, it's still not an ideal solution. Yet, Apple sells an iPad Pro, but while it's arguably more of a professional tool than, say, like AirPods Pro or iPhone Pro, it's hobbled by iOS. And credit where credit's due, Apple did a great thing by branching iOS into iPadOS in 2019, but it's still just a slightly more functional version of iOS. And it almost feels like every new feature we get is delivered with great reluctance and only after years of customer demands. Like, fine, you want multitasking? Well, you can have two windows side by side that are adjustable only in preset increments. That's not good enough? Well, we'll design a half-baked and horribly confusing window management system called Stage Manager that wastes screen space and still doesn't allow you to perform functions that have been available on Mac since the invention of Mac OS X multitasking in 2001. 22 years ago. To add insult to injury, Craig Federighi called iPad Apple's most versatile device, a label with which I vehemently disagree. This is all to say that the code base of iOS, combined with Apple's deep reluctance to cannibalize Mac sales, has made it impossible for Apple's software team to adequately respond to professional users' ongoing feedback. This is actually a company-wide problem, a leftover remnant of Steve Jobs' philosophy that the customer doesn't know what they want, and Jobs might have had a point, but only so far as he had a superb ability to again and again come up with new products that people wound up loving. The post-Jobs Apple doesn't have his magic touch. Many of Apple's decisions have been downright baffling, and sometimes it feels as if Apple lurches between consumer-friendly design choices and erratic attempts to rekindle long-spent fires. And one of the first major examples of this behavior came in December 2013 when Apple introduced what many have come to call the trash can Mac Pro.
Can't innovate anymore, my
Before this, I owned the cheese grater Mac Pro, which I loved. It had plenty of room for expansion, was fast for its time, and wasn't insanely more expensive than comparable PC alternatives in certain configurations. But it went ignored for many years. When Apple updated it, they released a compact cylinder that every single professional I spoke with already knew was completely useless. Graphics cards were getting bigger and bigger, and Apple designed a black tube with a thermal envelope not much better than a laptop's, and no room or ability to support more power-hungry chips. Perhaps, as Apple later claimed, they misjudged industry trends, or maybe Johnny Ive just really wanted a sleek tube to remind him of a very familiar failure in another historic Mac, the Power Mac G4 Cube from 2000. And this beautiful machine also had heat management issues because of its design. Anyway, Apple never meaningfully upgraded the trash can Mac Pro. In 2018, 5 years later, Apple admitted their failure and took the unusual step of pre-announcing that they were working on a proper Mac Pro replacement, even going so far as to sell an iMac Pro to tide professionals over. The 2019 Mac Pro returned to the cheese grater design and offered vastly superior expandability options, but at a dramatically increased price. And you can see a pattern here. Professionals cry out for more power, Apple spits out a product every few years that sort of addresses the professional needs, but doesn't ignore Apple's instinct to chart its own path. Then Apple goes back to ignoring the professional crowd until the cries become too loud to ignore once again. As if to prove this point further, Apple has not meaningfully updated the new Mac Pro since its release almost 4 years ago. It's almost hilarious how predictable this cycle is at this point. Yeah, they're obviously waiting on Apple's silicon to replace the Intel chips, but the rumors suggest this means going back to the trash can philosophy of limited upgradability. And on top of all this, the very thing that makes Apple's M1, M2, and upcoming M3 chips great, their power efficiency, is the same thing that might become their downfall in professional workflows. When it comes to desktop performance, I doubt you'll find many professionals who care about the power to performance metric. Most of us just want Apple to put Intel's latest Xeon chips into the Mac Pro, and NVIDIA graphics cards, though that'll obviously never happen, and call it a day. In terms of raw power, Intel's latest offerings have Apple's chips beat, and that's all pros really care about. Not to mention, there's still plenty of software that has poor compatibility with Apple Silicon, a major factor that has kept me from switching over. I briefly used a Mac Mini to test out Apple Silicon in my workflow, and there were way more crashes. And granted, this was about a year ago, so things may have improved since. And anyway, a similar pattern plays out in the MacBook Pro line, with the October 2016 Touch Bar model and several of its updated models afterwards not having sufficient cooling to power the Intel processors without overheating. I lost 3 MacBook Pros to overheating, all of which were covered by Apple's warranty, but was annoying to deal with nonetheless, especially when they kept cooking themselves to death under sustained load. My point is to illustrate that this behavior is pervasive across Apple's professional product line, including the iPad Pro. it doesn't feel as if Apple's designers are designing towards the needs of professional users. Rather, it feels as if they're responding years later to complaints and then often not addressing those complaints in a logical fashion. The 2019 Mac Pro was a solid product because Apple actually had professionals participate in the design process. But then Apple just abandoned it, selling it for the same price for years as if they'd continued updating the internal components to justify the cost. At this point, you might be asking, why should Apple pay so much attention to whining professionals? After all, professional users make up a fraction of Apple's hardware sales. Most of their money just comes from regular folks buying iPhones. Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. Software. Developers make up a tiny minority of Apple customers, yet they power in large part the iPhone's popularity. The launch of the App Store is one of the central reasons why the iPhone became so popular. Lose your professionals and you lose the creativity that continues to propel Apple's vast ecosystem. There's some other softer reasons why professionals are important, like their ability to guide industry trends, but it usually comes back to software. And speaking of software, this is where the iPad Pro struggles. I'm not sure it's even possible to give the machine a proper file system, multitasking support, and deep app permissions given the underlying software limitations. There are some excellent professional-grade apps on the iPad. Procreate and DaVinci Resolve come to mind, but the professional ecosystem is still severely limited. And having developed a rather complex iOS app, I can confidently say the lack of pro apps is in large part due to the difficulty of bringing professional-grade software to an operating system that's based on iOS. And macOS is still where serious work gets done. So where does that leave us? In my case, it leaves me wanting a touchscreen Mac. With Apple's latest custom chips, my desire for this mythical product has never been stronger. Even past advantages like the iPad's superior battery life are no longer a factor. I want the power and portability of a MacBook Pro with a stylus-supported touchscreen. There would be some immediate, obvious benefits for me. For example, I love working in Procreate on the iPad, however, I always run into layer limitations in my drawings. When working at high resolution, each drawing can only support 20 or 30 layers. My workaround is to make multiple files of the same drawing, then work on different areas in each file, flattening these areas when I'm finished, and then pasting them into a final version. And this is far from ideal, especially when I'm used to easily working with hundreds of layers in the Mac and Photoshop and several specialized drawing applications. And there's many other examples of tasks that are trivial to complete on a Mac, like updating files on a server, which technically can be accomplished on an iPad, but are comparatively frustrating, slow, and sometimes broken experiences. Then there's an equally important reason why I want a touchscreen Mac. In my ever-present desire to eliminate extraneous devices, I believe a touchscreen MacBook Pro could plausibly become my sole computer, aside from a ThinkPad I use to write my novels because it has a far better keyboard. And herein lies the problem. Apple does not want me to own a single device when I could buy 2 or 3. And why not 4? They'd rather twist and contort the iPad to make it semi-usable for pros than to produce a proper touchscreen Mac. If the current rumors are true and Apple is really testing a touchscreen Mac for release in 2025 or beyond, I wouldn't be overly surprised if it's hobbled in some way that makes the iPad Pro still necessary. And maybe the Mac won't support a stylus, or perhaps Apple won't adopt any of the half-dozen ways PC manufacturers have invented to make the screen lay flat, but I think it'll be something. In the meantime though, I'm stuck using my iPad Pro for my Apple ecosystem portable touchscreen needs, which brings me to how my iPad came to look very much like a MacBook Pro. It's no secret that I love Apple's Magic Keyboard for the iPad Pro, but it's far from perfect. The trackpad is tiny, key travel is limited, there's no function row, and the angles at which you can set the screen are limited enough that it makes typing on my lap uncomfortable. For years, I've been searching for a better solution, one that more closely matches the absolute pleasure I get from typing on my ThinkPad. And I may have finally found my answer. Let me show you the Brydge Max Plus, an iPad keyboard that might just outmagic Apple's keyboard. Now, everyone who's shopping for a device like this probably has slightly different criteria. For example, if you value portability above all else, neither of these options are for you. You'll want to look at the Folio or similar products that weigh comparatively little. But if you want to turn your iPad into a great writing tool, I think I have the answer. The Brydge adopts a traditional laptop form factor, meaning the bottom of the screen sits near the hinge at the back of the deck. There's 4 serious benefits you get with this simple difference from the Magic Keyboard, which levitates the screen above the keys. First, you can adjust the screen 135 degrees. All of the computing bits are located behind the iPad's screen, obviously, so that presents a balance issue. On the Magic Keyboard, that means the screen doesn't tilt back very far at all. On my lap, a fully tilted screen is still at an oblique angle to my eye line, making it much more comfortable to type on a desk. The Brydge is more flexible, allowing you to tilt the screen further back to make the angle more comfortable. However, it does come with a downside, which is that the weight of the screen will likely tip the iPad off your lap if you remove your hands from the keyboard. So there's a trade-off here. On one hand, you get more extreme angles, but on the other hand, these angles compromise the iPad's stability when not placed on a flat surface like a desk. Second, you have room for a function row. Because the iPad isn't looming above the keyboard, the keys can be placed much further back on the deck. I use function keys all the time to adjust brightness, volume, and play and pause music. Having these available at a single button press is something I missed while using the Magic Keyboard and love on the Brydge. Third, there's actual room to rest your wrists. On the Magic Keyboard, the edge of the bottom panel digs in right where my palms are, and whatever material is underneath is my de facto wrist rest. Now, you might find this comfortable for your hands, but I prefer enough space to rest my wrists on a solid, unbroken surface, just like almost any other standard laptop. Of course, the cold metal of the Brydge isn't the most comfortable surface. My ThinkPad, for example, uses a soft touch material that is far more forgiving for extended writing sessions. Fourth, the trackpad is much larger, another benefit of moving the keys further back. The Magic Keyboard's trackpad is almost comically tiny, especially by modern standards, and it's a relief to go back to using a larger touch surface. But let's talk more about the trackpad. Apple's current laptops forego a physical click for a little buzz of haptic feedback, a change that I wasn't in love with, but I've had to accept as consumer electronics companies gradually take away all of our moving buttons. Interestingly, the Magic Keyboard is perhaps the only Apple device that still has a physical click, maybe because the trackpad hardware is too thin to incorporate a feedback motor, and also because it would use more electricity. You can click anywhere on the tiny trackpad surface though, and it works. The Brydge's trackpad also uses a physical click, however, it's hinged, meaning it's easier to click on the bottom, a little harder to click in the middle, and almost impossible to press along the top. The click is a bit mushier than the Magic Keyboard's, and maybe a bit louder as well. It's also worse at recognizing your clicks, which is extremely disappointing. I will say that Brydge has issued a number of software updates that have taken the trackpad from basically unusable to generally pretty good, but there are issues. For example, I use double-clicking all the time while writing to select a single word, only it doesn't select the word a lot of the time. After spending a few minutes trying to figure out why, I realize that the cursor jumps down in the moment between the first and second click of a double click. So it's actually clicking once on the intended word and then again just below. And this might be because my finger slips down for some unknown reason, or maybe there should be a software fix that disables the trackpad for a fraction of a second after one click. I'm not sure. All I know is that this is the only trackpad I've ever used where I've had this particular problem, so either the hardware is wonky somehow, or the finger tracking software is a bit off. Other than that, the multi-touch gestures generally work well, and the cursor movement is usually smooth. The reason why I say generally and usually is because there is occasional lag and jumpiness. When it happens, I overshoot my click target or wind up activating some multi-touch feature I never intended. Another minor issue is that with very slow two-finger scrolling, the trackpad sometimes mistakes the scroll for a pinch and zoom, making whatever you're looking at unexpectedly larger rather than scrolling the page. Palm rejection, though, is thankfully excellent. I'm going to blame the keyboard's Bluetooth connection for the occasional jumpiness. Which brings us to a major difference between the Brydge and Magic Keyboard. Snap your iPad to Apple's version and you're connected at once via the smart connector pins. That means a few things. The keyboard is drawing power from the iPad itself, you gain an extra USB-C port for charging on the opposite side, and there's virtually zero connection issues. As Steve Jobs loved to say,
it just works the way it ought to. So it all just works. It just all works. It just, boom, pops to life and works.
And not so with Brydge, which uses Bluetooth 5.0 to connect. The keyboard will remain connected to the iPad in low power mode for 4 hours after the last time you've used it. If you tap a key, it'll wake the iPad up, just like the Magic Keyboard. After that, though, you'll have to wake it up the old-fashioned way by hitting the power button or tapping on the screen. Not a huge deal, but it does take a couple of seconds for the keyboard to reconnect, just like any other Bluetooth device. The fact that the Brydge has its own built-in battery is both a positive and a negative. Some users of the Magic Keyboard have reported rapid battery drain from their iPad. I've never been able to replicate this issue, but I do notice a difference in battery life when it's connected. The iPad's battery simply empties faster when it's also powering the keyboard and its backlight. Because you charge the Brydge separately via its own USB-C port, you don't need to worry about that at all. However, you do need to worry about remembering to charge the keyboard itself. Brydge claims a 3-month battery life in typical usage, and my usage is far from typical. If you're using this thing to write all day, you might drain it in less than a week. I don't consider this a big deal though, because it charges using the same connection as your iPad, meaning if you have your iPad with you anyway, then you likely also have a charger for the keyboard. Still, it's mildly annoying. Next, let's look at the physical attributes of the device, and this is where things get really complicated. I thought the Magic Keyboard was heavy until I lifted the Brydge for the first time, and this thing is heavy. Remember Microsoft's Surface Book? It had a detachable screen that included most of the computer's circuitry, as well as a battery. The keyboard had another battery and some additional graphics hardware, but it meant that the thing was ridiculously top-heavy. With the Brydge Max Plus, you're looking at Surface Book 2.0. The keyboard has to be heavy, otherwise the iPad would tip over. And Apple solved this by changing the center of gravity, hanging the iPad above the keyboard. Brydge solved it by making the keyboard heavier. As I already mentioned, this does have the added benefit of more room on the deck and a greater ability to angle the screen. It also gives the keyboard more vertical height, allowing for greater key travel, something I'll discuss more later. The material itself is aluminum, just like an Apple device, and it feels about as premium as one of their notebooks, except for some unwanted flexibility underneath. When I lift the thing up from its side, which I do all the time, it clicks. At first, I thought it was literally activating the trackpad, but while the clicking does seem related to the trackpad, it's not actually activating the full click mechanism, so maybe it's fine to ignore this quirk. As for durability, I've owned briefly 2 Brydge keyboards in the past, both of which were defective in various ways. If you get a functional unit, it feels sturdy enough to last a while, but I can't make any promises here. Just make sure to test every key thoroughly and be ready to exchange your unit if any are not working. I do like that the metal doesn't absorb finger grease like the Magic Keyboard's soft touch material. And that thing gets nasty even if you clean it every day, and I don't foresee the same issue with the Brydge, at least not on the bottom half. The outer shell is a bit softer, so it may degrade over time. Another factor to consider is the ease with which you can attach and remove the iPad from the dock. Past Brydge keyboards were terrible in this regard, requiring you to clip the iPad into an awkward U-shaped bracket. And the Brydge Max Plus luckily uses magnets, just like the Magic Keyboard. However, the Magic Keyboard setup is definitely easier to manage. Because I draw and write a lot on my iPad, I'm constantly attaching and detaching it from the keyboard. The Magic Keyboard stand component is not flush with the entire back of the iPad, so pulling the tablet away is a simple matter of grabbing it. There's a bit more finesse required with the Brydge in that you have to kind of peel it away with your fingertips from the top. And I'm not saying it's at all difficult, but it is something I do notice throughout the day. Finally, let's talk about the keyboard. I'm surprised to say that I actually like it better than the Magic Keyboard, which I enjoy quite a bit. That has to do primarily with the somewhat deeper key travel, but it also has to do with the key separation. On chiclet-style keyboards, I tend to like a little bit more separation between the keys than Apple provides. The Brydge, in my opinion, has the perfect amount of separation. Another thing I was worried about was the potential of the keys being too loose. Taller and smaller keys can sometimes wobble atop their scissor switches because stability decreases with the lower surface area. And this isn't the case with the Brydge keyboard. There's a reassuring firmness to the board without the keys being too difficult to press. And the plastic of the keys themselves is ever so slightly more textured without feeling cheap or rough, something I also appreciate. All the keys are where I'd expect, and my fingers are never confused where to tap to achieve the desired result. I've only typed maybe between 10 and 20,000 words so far, but I'm pretty confident in saying that I actually like this keyboard more than the one on the newest MacBook Pros and the Magic Keyboard. It's just more satisfying. The backlight is also nice, giving you 3 levels of adjustable brightness, though the way the light shines from beneath the keys is very mildly annoying. Overall, I think you'll be happy with the typing experience. So, did Brydge beat Apple by making a superior iPad accessory? The answer is just that they chose to focus on different features and therefore made a different set of sacrifices. Both are heavy, but the Brydge is really heavy. One doesn't need to use Bluetooth, but drains the iPad's battery, and the other has its own battery. Apple gives you a superior but tiny trackpad, while Brydge goes bigger and is just slightly worse. So really, it's a toss-up, but I'm definitely super impressed with the Brydge keyboard and plan to keep using it for a long while. I want to finish this discussion by talking about price. I paid $100 for the sale price of the Brydge keyboard, which is normally $200. But even at $200, believe it or not, it's a bargain next to Apple's option, which costs $350. Maybe the real magic in Apple's Magic Keyboard is Tim Cook's ability to persuade consumers to pay for a keyboard more than the cost of Apple's entry-level iPad. So when you take price into consideration, the choice is obvious. Brydge makes the best keyboard for the iPad Pro. Yet, I resent the fact that I even want to attach a keyboard to use a trackpad for the iPad Pro in the first place. Like, why can't the iPad be just an iPad? Keep it as a large screen consumption device with somewhat more advanced iPhone apps and give us a touchscreen Mac for actual professional needs. With shared Apple Silicon chips, we might even be able to run iPad apps on the Mac, something that's possible in a super limited sense with Apple's current development tools. An M3-equipped MacBook Pro with a stylus-supported touchscreen and a form factor that mimics any number of successful Windows PC designs could become my single computer. I could use it for coding, photo and video editing, drawing, animating, and anything else I like. I think it's possible that Apple may release a touchscreen Mac in the coming years, but somehow I believe in their ability to hobble it in a way that makes owning an iPad still a necessary part of their product strategy. Thanks for watching. I'm currently testing a computer that cost only $100 to see if it's a worthy writing machine. So consider subscribing for that video, and I'll see you soon.